A Tale of Two Vietnams. Before 1975, there was North Vietnam and South Vietnam. They were two separate countries with two separate flag carriers, Vietnam Airlines and Air Vietnam. The latter ceased to exist after the Vietnam War, and so Vietnam Airlines became the country's national flag carrier when Vietnam was reunified, but this airline has a history that goes back much further than 1975. In fact, it was founded all the way back in 1951. This is the story of Vietnam Airlines. Part 1. The early years. Back in 1951, it started off as Vietnam Civil Aviation, and it operated under the Ministry of Defense. It ran domestic scheduled flights between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, as well as some international routes to neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos. But shortly after, in 1955, Vietnam was split into two separate countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The North kept the name Vietnam, and the South called itself the Republic of Vietnam. They even had different flags. The North had a red flag with a yellow star, and the South had a red, blue, and white striped flag with a yellow sun in the middle. Both countries had their own flag carriers too, Vietnam Airlines in the North and Air Vietnam in the South. Vietnam Airlines continued to operate domestic flights within the North, and they also flew to international destinations like Beijing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Moscow. They even had a flight to Paris, which at the time was one of the longest flights in the world. When the Vietnam War broke out in the 1960s, Vietnam Airlines struggled. Many of its planes were shot down by U.S. forces, and so the airline focused primarily on domestic flights. By 1975, Vietnam Airlines had just 5 aircraft left, and those were only used for domestic flights. After the Vietnam War ended and the country was reunited, Vietnam Airlines took over the domestic routes from Air Vietnam in the South. The company was restructured in 1989, and it became known as Vietnam Airlines Corporation Limited Company in 1997. This is when the airline was officially established, and it was no longer under the Ministry of Defense. Instead, it was a state-owned enterprise under the Ministry of Transport. The national flag carrier then began expanding its network once again. At first, they concentrated on nearby Asian destinations like Bangkok, Taipei, and Kuala Lumpur. But pretty soon they added many more long-haul routes to cities like London, Paris, and Frankfurt. In 2007, Vietnam Airlines became the first airline based in Vietnam to fly to the United States. They started off with 2 weekly flights between Hanoi and San Francisco. Today, however, there are nearly 50 non-stop flights every week between the two countries with multiple airlines from both sides. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's go back to 2010, when Vietnam Airlines joined the Global Airline Alliance, SkyTeam. This was a big deal because it meant that passengers could earn and redeem miles across all of the member airlines. And it also meant that Vietnam Airlines could serve more destinations through quota sharing. Today, the airline flies to over 35 domestic and 40 international destinations. Some of their most popular international destinations include Seoul, Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Los Angeles, Canberra, Melbourne, and Paris. The airline has taken delivery of many new aircraft in the past 10 years, and today they operate a fleet of 103 planes. That includes 31 Airbus A350s, 25 Boeing 787s, 22 Airbus A330s, and 25 next-generation Embraer 190s for shorter domestic routes. Looking at their fleet, it's clear that Vietnam Airlines is a modern airline. In fact, they don't have a single aircraft that's older than 10 years. And this helps them keep costs low and, of course, helps them be competitive with other airlines in the region. It also helps that the airline has an excellent safety record, according to the Airline Safety Database. There hasn't been a fatal accident involving any airline from Vietnam since the rebranding in 1997. Knock on wood. But being a modern, young, and well-managed airline doesn't automatically make an airline great. The airline needs to be constantly improving and evolving, and that's exactly what Vietnam Airlines has been doing over the past decade. They introduced lie-flat beds in business class, for example, and they've updated their economy class seats. The airline is also becoming more and more sustainable. They offset carbon dioxide emissions from flights, departing in 2021, and they're focusing heavily on digital transformation. For example, they launched a chatbot on their website to help customers find cheap tickets. They also allow passengers to check in online and choose their seats in advance. In the future, Vietnam Airlines plans to start flying to more destinations in Europe and the Americas. They also want to become the leading airline in Southeast Asia, but there is stiff competition in that region. In particular, Singapore Airlines and their low-cost subsidiary Scoot are really popular, and so Vietnam Airlines might have a tough time trying to compete. Regardless though, they are certainly on the right track. The airline is profitable, and they're continually improving. So now let's take a look at the uniforms and the lounges. The uniforms for Vietnam Airlines were designed by renowned fashion designer Sona Nozawa. She's designed uniforms for several other airlines as well. including all Nippon Airways, EVA Air, and Cathay Pacific. And she's also designed uniforms for hotels and even Olympic teams. The design features the traditional Vietnamese ao dye, and it comes in both a modern and classic style. Interestingly enough, each uniform represents a different season. The red and gold uniform is for spring, summer, and autumn, while the blue and silver outfit is for winter. Flight attendants wear the red and gold uniform on their daytime flights, and the blue and silver uniform on their nighttime flights. Pilots also have two different uniforms. Their daytime uniform consists of a white suit with a red tie, and for nighttime flights they wear a navy blue suit with a red tie. Now we take a look at the lounges. Unfortunately, Vietnam Airlines doesn't have any first-class lounges at the moment, but they do have some business-class lounges. There are 2 business-class lounges in Hanoi and 1 in Ho Chi Minh City. You can access these lounges if you're reflying in business or if you hold a premium economy ticket. If you have elite status with Vietnam Airlines, you can also use the lounges with 1 guest. Finally, if you're connecting in Vietnam and have a layover of more than 8 hours, you can use the lounge for free. If you ask me, Vietnam Airlines looks like a great airline. They have a bunch of modern, fuel-efficient aircraft. They're part of a major global alliance, and they have an award-winning design. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but the airline is clearly moving in the right direction. It's worth noting that the history of Vietnam Airlines dates back to before the Vietnam War, but the airline that exists today didn't actually start until after the war ended. So it seems like this would be a good time to talk about the history of Vietnam since the end of the war. After the war ended, Vietnam was finally reunified, and the country entered a period of rapid economic growth. They adopted a socialist-oriented market economy, which allowed for private ownership of businesses. The government also implemented a policy of doi moi, which aimed to integrate Vietnam more into the global economy. These policies led to massive growth and development, and today, Vietnam is considered an emerging economy. It's one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. In fact, Vietnam has also become a popular destination for tourists. In recent years, they've seen a huge increase in the number of visitors. In 2019, for example, Vietnam welcomed nearly 18 million tourists. That's around 7% of their total population. And of course, this has been stunted by the pandemic. But the number of tourists visiting Vietnam has been growing exponentially, and it's expected to continue growing in the coming years. Vietnam Airlines plays a huge role in this. The airline is the country's national flag carrier, and it represents Vietnam when it flies to other countries. In a sense, they're almost like a billboard for tourism in Vietnam. The more people that fly with Vietnam Airlines, the more likely they are to visit Vietnam. And that's why it's so important for Vietnam Airlines to be a high-quality airline. They're not just transporting passengers from point A to point B, they're also helping to promote Vietnam to the world. Thank you for watching. Have you ever flown with Vietnam Airlines? Let me know your experience in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.